All right. Good day, friends, once again, and welcome to Liberation Alliance Africa's disruptive space. My name is Oluwatobiloba Ayodele, and together with Omolara Oriye, we dream on decolonial and liberatory realities for African women, girls, and gender expansive persons. I don't know if Omolara is here to share a bit more about what we do at LAA. I'm sure some of us are old friends, some of us are new friends, and Omolara, are you here to share more about what we do?
Yes. Hi, everybody. Give me a quick moment. Thank you so much for joining our conversation today. We really appreciate your presence, and we thank you so much. My name is Omolara Ray, and as Toby has shared, together we dream of our amazing feminist futures, of interesting decolonial realities where we do not only have intellectual agency, but we also have, an Africa that has got its own dreams and is able to fulfill those dreams without so much, interruption on the part of, systems that are interested in continue to colonize and wield imperialist powers over the life of not only Africans, but women, girls, and gender expansive persons. I'm here to just say a few words about Liberation Alliance Africa. I'm so happy to see the faces of our speakers. Thank you so much. We know you have swam through 7 seas and climbed several mountains to be here today. And, we want to let you know that we appreciate that so much. Liberation Alliance is a feminist Pan-African collective raising critical consciousness through radical knowledge production, policy advocacy, decolonial feminist organizing. And one of the most interesting parts of what we do for me is our work to document the cultural evolution of a liberated Africa. In an Africa in which women and girls are not additions to, larger conversations, an Africa that does have epistemological agency and integrity, that is not going to be questioned by, any Tom, Dick, and Harry because of the structures that hold up power and in turn, knowledge, in the world. We are keen to contribute to the disruption of colonial and patriarchal legacies that perpetuate oppression, exploitation, and exclusion in Africa. So that's a very short, summary of what we do at Liberation Alliance. And how do we do this? We do this literally by allowing ourselves the luxury of dreaming. We do this by, dreaming of our feminist collective. We do this through the creation of knowledge and the nurturing, of community and movements across Africa. So our work, you will find that expands around the continent. And even though we are babies at the moment, we are babies standing on the shoulders of giants. And so we are seeing far, and we are, having the luxury of clean air up there. So I just want to thank you once again for coming, and over to you, Toby.
Thanks, Omolara, and thank you for that kind introduction. My colleague Nana will also share our website link in the chat if you want to read more about us and keep up with updates on the work that we do. You can sign up to our newsletter, and we are also on social media, and you can follow us. Nana will share all the details in the chat. And the conversation we're having today is the third installation of the 5-part series titled Disrupting Colonial Legacies in Africa. The series is aimed at identifying and analyzing colonial values and ideologies around oppressive systems and constructs. We started this series because we wanted to really interrogate colonial legacies in systems that we advocate for in this feminist movement. And we will also just didn't want to jump into the advocacy or into the movement without looking at the root causes of all of these systems of oppression. The first part of the series was focused on leadership. So we interrogated, colonial legacies of leadership in Africa, and we were opportune to have amazing speakers on the webinar. The second part of the series was on climate justice, which was in, I think, August. And we were also grateful to have feminist scholars and climate justice activists as speakers to also lead in that conversation. This third part is focused on economic justice. And I am so proud that we have 3 speakers leading the conversation today. So far, we have hosted these 2 episodes, and you can find them on YouTube, on our YouTube channel. My colleague, Nana, again, you would hear me mention Nana a lot today, but never mind, she doesn't mind me calling her out. She'll be sharing the links to the past episodes if you want to catch up with the series. We are also going to be tweeting some of the live conversations we have here on Twitter or X. We are going to be tweeting on there using the hashtag DCL Economic Justice. And you can, tweet along with us and tag us on Twitter or Instagram or wherever you feel you can express or amplify this conversation with us. So today I am honored to be moderating the 3rd episode, which I have said is focused on economic justice. And the reason why we are focusing on economic justice in this 3rd installation is because we've analyzed the current economic crisis in Africa, and we've seen that it demonstrates the effects of years of social and economic exploitation of women combined with saviourism policies from foreign institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The effect is what we see in our degraded public services, poor healthcare, unpaid labor, capitalist macroeconomics policies. We've seen it in the way women's labor are invisibilized. We've seen it in the way women's contribution to the economy is not recognized. We've seen it in the way women continue to bear the brunt of the economic injustice. And we've also seen it in the way women are unpaid or underpaid in their labor. All of these things are things that we are going to be talking about today. And I'm glad to introduce our speakers who will be leading the conversation. We have Leah Eyonyu, Fatima Keleha, and Krista Simeone. I do apologize if I'm not pronouncing your names correctly. I'm Nigerian and I am Yoruba, and I have Yoruba intonation. So you would hear me say some things and you'll be wondering why. It is because my mother and father are Yoruba and they birthed me from that tongue. So hooray to me. Anyways, Leah, Fatima, and Krista will be leading this conversation, and they will usher us into a space to rethink and interrogate the existing economic structures in Africa and its continuous negative effects on African women and gender-expansive persons. Leah is an emerging feminist political economy analyst and researcher. Her work cuts across the fields of fiscal justice, social reproduction, and labor market. She is currently overseeing the development of a new African feminist tax initiative and awaiting the awarding of an MSc in inequalities and social science from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Please welcome Leah into the conversation. You can welcome her in the chat, your favorite emoji. And I'm sure, Leah is, thanks Leah for joining. Our speaker again is Crystal. Crystal is a Pan-African feminist activist and director of NAWI, the AfriFame Macroeconomics Collective, the NAWI Collective. She works at the intersection of the technical and colloquial of critique and imagination, of knowledge and practice, of language, and of the creation of community. She curates the work of the NAWI Collective, who, in community with other African feminists and organizations, work on analyzing, influencing, and reimagining macro-level economic policies and narratives. Please welcome Crystal also with your favorite emojis in the chat. Thank you, everyone. And we have Fatima. Fatima is a feminist political economics, strategic and technical advisor, researcher, and activist with over 20 years of experience working globally, but more specifically with countries in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean at various levels. She focuses much of her work on gender and economic rights and justice issues, using African and Southern feminist and justice frameworks, with particular specialization in feminist macroeconomics, covering trade, decent work, care, taxation, budget and fiscal space, agriculture, and feminist economic alternatives more widely. So you can see that we have a wide range of speakers with different backgrounds and deep knowledge in macroeconomics analysis. So I am so proud that we have these speakers, and I am so proud also that we have everyone joining this conversation. I'm seeing already people introducing themselves from different parts of the world, and we are honored that you are here with us in this space as we disrupt colonial legacies of economic justice. To start the conversation, and you should stop hearing my voice, I've been speaking for too long. To start the conversation, I would like to ask the speakers to provide a picture of the economic landscape in Africa before colonial interruptions. So help us reflect or dream with us on what economic justice looks like, against today's reality. What did it look like before colonial disruption? I don't know who wants to start us off. Leah?
Yeah, sure, Toby. Thank you so much. I feel truly privileged to be to have been invited to share some of my thoughts. I will preface this by saying there's some things that I am well equipped to talk about, some things not so much, but I'll give it all my best. I will also preface this again by saying that when we look at the pre-colonial period in African history, it is an area that is under-researched, and so many times it's difficult to find information. African history, and I'm happy that LAA is doing work around just rediscovering and creating our own epistemology. Omolara talked about epistemic agency. I think those are the words that were used, and I think retracing where we came from, where our past is located, is part of that very important work. So in thinking about Africa's economic past in the pre-colonial period, it's also important, I think, to appreciate the prevailing circumstances of the time, because that ultimately influenced the kind of economic activities that people were involved in. Particularly, it's important to think about Africa's topography, Africa's geography, and also Africa's political organization, because all of those influence the kinds of activities. But also, it's such a broad question. I don't know how far back to look. So I'll just talk about something that I'm comfortable with, because we can go as far back as the 10th century. All of that information is documented, although not as deeply as histories from other regions. So in terms of the geography, the location of certain societies, whether within the coast or within the interior of Africa, determined what kinds of economic activities that they were involved in. Societies that were on the coast that have now developed to be countries such as Nigeria, where you are, in Ghana, where I am, those are countries that were a lot more involved in trade, not just with Africans within the interior, but also other civilizations, which was also became the entry point for colonialism. But by and large, Africa, as it is now, was a largely agrarian society. But the degree of participation in agriculture and thinking about crops specifically depended on the soil quality as well. So that impacted that a lot. So you have a situation where part of where the Sahara is right now used to be a lush forest, but also that sometimes meant that it was intertwined with the wild. It is not possible to settle within something like that, but people were largely agrarian communities, growing things such as grain, domesticating and creating the seed varieties that we have to date. A lot of communities were pastoralists. If you're looking at the Interlacustrine region within East and Central Africa, cows, animals were a great part of that culture. And that informed basically how the communities organized. Some of them were nomads. Some of them were more centralized communities that had a proper governance systems. If you go to places like what is current day Uganda, which was the Buganda Kingdom, you have a very sophisticated system of governance that was very centralized, where you had what would now contemporarily be considered as a monarch that was overseeing processes of economic development and things like that. And then on the other hand, I'll make this brief because my panelists, my colleagues will also add on to this. So on the one hand, I've talked about agriculture, looking at farming and pastoralism. But then the other thing that Africa is known for is Africa's own ironwork, which goes as far back as the 10th century, actually maybe even BC. I forget the dates. If you go to the British Museum, where some of our artifacts are held hostage currently, you're able to see Africa's creativity, but also that history frozen in time in the form of some of the work that is on display, but this is mostly art. But it is really this iron work that also revolutionized kind of the agricultural work that was being done, enabling the building of whores that people used as they were digging, as they were planting. So iron work is also something that was integral to African states. And then very lastly, maybe something that I'd forgotten, I just talked about trade very briefly, but there was also a lot of inter-regional trade within the interior. A lot of the trade was based on kinship networks. People really produced what they needed for subsistence and exchanged only the things that they did not have. I think I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Leah. It's interesting to hear you mention things like, sophisticated, centralized trade, even in the pre-colonial era, and what economy looked like before the colonialism. These are things that you would hear or you would read about in books, and how, it was the colonial masters that brought about sophistication or centralization or trade. So we use those terms even back then. And it's interesting to also hear you talk about the intersectionality of agriculture and iron, and also trade, and how we produce things that were needed and we exchange things amongst each other. I would like to also hear from Crystal and Fatima on their submission on that.
Yeah, so when I think about the economy, I think there's a noise coming from somebody. Okay, it stopped. The economy is really just our relationship, our material relationship with each other, but also the rest of the living world. Leah spoke about like our metals, and this has such a deep intersection also with our culture and how it manifested in what we smithed, what we grew, what we ate, what we exchanged, how we did it. So it's also important to remember a cultural manifestation and an integration with our economy, which seems to be a little bit lost as we have evolved into the current way that we live. But really, when you hear about Africa, women, and the economy currently, it's always seemingly very small, very micro, very individually targeted interventions. Whereas it wasn't the same as Leah put it. It's basically how fairly we collect the economy, how fairly we collect our revenue through our taxation, and how equitably we distribute it through our budgets. But then let's go back a bit, and I'd like to touch on the element of trade that Leah opened up. Globally, we're told this narrative, this story that we're told about the Industrial Revolution, which was a transition to new manufacturing processes in both Europe and the US from, between 1760 to 1820, 1840. The story that, that's where things evolved. And that's where, you know, you spoke about sophistication and not us not hearing those words in our own dynamic, in our own history. But the Industrial Revolution is sort of that point where this was happening in the West. But this story is so wrong on so many levels. It assumes that there were no connections between Europe or America and the rest of the world. And it really paints a very ahistorical and apolitical, as well as a patriarchal picture. So I'll give you a few numbers just to paint a picture. And what the Europeans really were after. So in South America, silver, with regards to silver, over 100 million kilos was extracted and shipped to Europe between 1500 and 1800. And if you do a quick calculation, invested in 1800 at only 5%, it would equate to $165 trillion today. So this begins to paint a picture of the largesse of their extraction. It provided a lot of the capital for the Industrial Revolution and allowed Europe to build up its military capacity and to buy agricultural produce from the East. But let's move back to the continent and through trade, and specifically the Atlantic slave trade, where 15 million enslaved Africans were shipped across the Atlantic. They grew sugar, which was an important source of calories for Europe, and they grew cotton, which was a key raw material for the same Industrial Revolution. Without sugar and cotton produced by enslaved Africans on colonized land, Europe really could never have had an Industrial Revolution. And we have to remember that as we redefine and reimagine the histories and the stories and narratives that are told to us, that we also begin to almost believe ourselves. And if you put it in numbers, it was 222 million hours of unpaid labor in North America from 1619 to 1865. Paid at the US minimum wage, it would be worth $97 trillion today. And even then, this number doesn't account for women's unrecognized, unseen, and invisibilized labor. It was women that took care of the sick, that buried the dead, that reproduced the labor that, you know, went into this, and all grown on stolen lands, on stolen indigenous lands in Latin America. And this was really the beginning of the rise of capitalism as we understand it, dependent on the theft of lands and people and labor. So I'll stop there because I know Fatima has a lot to say, but I also just wanted to bring in this concept of the narratives that we tell ourselves globally, but on whose sweat, whose labor, and whose lands do they stand on, and whose narratives do they put out in the world, and whose stories do they completely erase? And it's just something to plant as a seed.
Thank you so much, Crystal. And I think, yes, I hear you completely on whose shoulders, whose sweat are all of these stories standing on. And it's really something that we all must really think about when we start reimagining economic justice. Fatima, over to you.
Thank you very much. So I think everything that Leah and Crystal have said so far, I completely agree with. And I think one of the things that we need to think about in terms of, you know, when we look at what was happening on the continent pre-colonization, it is hard. And I think Leah's point about, you know, the under-research is really critical here, but also there has been quite a systematic attempt to ensure that the history of Africa pre-colonially has been subsumed. And so that's one of the reasons why it has made it very difficult. But there are stages to all of it. So we also have a difficulty in understanding exactly what point of the pre-colonial history are we looking at. The colonization of the continent was a gradual one. It didn't start, it was not just a moment in time that occurred at a certain point. It has been a gradual one, but we know that it accelerated as a result of the capitalist project about 400 years ago. And that mark we now feel very critically today, and it has set the foundation for where we are. I want to talk about something that I read actually in a fantastic travel book by the Nigerian travel writer Nor Sarawiwa, who is the daughter of Ken Sarawiwa. It's called Travels in Trans Wonderland. And she actually goes home to Nigeria and travels around the country. This was back in 2012 or something like that. And she goes to Kano, which is means a lot to me because my own family is from Kano as well as from Katsina. And she basically spent some time at the Kano Doba. And there she describes the way in which the Durbar essentially is rolled out completely effortlessly by the Emir's palace and by all of the traditional structures that have been in place for hundreds of years to essentially enact this procession, which everybody in the community is familiar with. And it is so efficient and so effortless and so perfect. And then when it ends, modernity returns. And once again, we are in the chaos that many Nigerians will recognize of things just not working. And that really struck me because what that speaks to actually is the disruption and the deliberate dismantling actually that occurred of our own traditional structures, which made our society work, and the economy that was part and parcel of that, and the way in which today we are still struggling with the colonial project and its ramifications, particularly post-independence, which have essentially never, gone away because there has been a new spate of neocolonialism. And what we cannot do really is divorce ourselves in terms of where we are today from that colonial reality and what occurred. And I think Crystal has given some excellent examples of how the colonial project was responsible for the ascendancy of the West and the existing power structure today that we're dealing with. But we also know that, African resources as part of that colonialism has been central to that ascendancy and the power that the global geopolitical order has created with the many institutions that you mentioned at the beginning, such as the IMF, the power that they now have to essentially dictate African policies, including economic policy. The extraction was myriad in its nature and the role that it's played. Human labor, we know, was forcibly taken, as has been mentioned. Congolese copper was actually central to that ascendancy. It was Africa's chief mineral export in the 19th and 20th centuries, and it powered the age of electricity, without which the 20th century and the ascendancy of Europe as well as the US would never have occurred. We also know that Congolese copper was used to rebuild post-war Europe and Japan. And so when you think about many of our own countries that are struggling to rebuild post-conflict and are in this constant cycle of returning to conflict, and yet it was essentially our own continent's copper that led to the rebuilding of previous, colonial overlords. And very interestingly, colonial Congolese uranium was used in the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, something that I thought would be worth mentioning because of the recent interest in the movie Oppenheimer in the summer. And one of the many things that was left out of that movie was this somebody came in there with with some music. And so that relationship between militarization, indeed the militarization of the US and the power that it wields on the geopolitical stage, and the way in which African extraction was essentially essential to that process. And so when we think about what was happening pre-colonially, there are many different realities that we could speak of, and the continent is so vast and so diverse. We could talk about examples, but we can't get too bogged down, I think, in that. There will be some places where there would have been very centralized, quite imperialist kingdoms. We cannot, for example, deny both the pride and, the possible question mark that we have over, Mansa Musa being the richest man in the world and effectively, as the history goes, destroying economies as he made his travel to Hajj because he carried so much gold with him and it flooded the markets of each successive city that he turned up. But then there's also a great source of some kind of pride in that because we know the kind of wealth that we were able to accumulate on the continent. But then there are other societies as well where, that kind of imperialist economy did not exist, where we're talking about common land and the use of common resources and the way in which a more egalitarian and democratic society was already in place before European versions and visions of democracy were imposed on us through institutions that they created. So I think it's important for us to look at both the diversity and the fact that there are many different realities of pre-colonial economies on the continent, but then very critically to look at where we are today as a result of the colonial trajectory that was created, and then indeed the post-independence trajectory. And I think that's quite critical. Probably we'll come to that in a second, because I think that's really what we need to unpack in order to understand where we are.
Thank you so much, Fatima. You've in fact ushered us into the next stage of the conversation. And I really like how, you all, just gave us that picture of what the reality looked like before colonialism. And the fact that you stressed that in as much as we must, pride in the good things that we did, in the right things that we did, we must also not neglect to mention the not so good things that happened even before colonialism. And then we've looked at, all of these works that we did. And I was just reflecting on how, our ancestors did the work. It's not like, oh, we didn't know what we were about or we didn't know what we were doing. We knew what we were doing in terms of trade, in terms of negotiating, economic building systems. However, the interruptions with colonialism disrupted perhaps what could have happened, and we would never know what we would have become without the influence of colonialism. And just to build on that, and to say that now that we know, our history, now that we know that, even without colonialism, we had gaps also, I wanted to pose this question to you all about what do you think are the factors that have contributed to the sustenance of economic injustice in Africa? So now that we say we are independent, although we say it's flag independence because, colonialism did not only colonize our resources, it colonized our minds. And that is the work that we are trying to do to decolonize our minds also and be free from the chokeholds of colonial mindsets. However, we've seen, the passage of colonialism in Africa through flag independence, and we've been trying to rebuild our economy, to go back to our roots, to what, the works of our ancestors, what they started. And the reality now is that we are far from, where we started from. And we want to know, the factors that are contributing to the sustenance of economic injustice in Africa. So maybe I start with Crystal this time.
Okay. Yeah, so I stopped at the slave trade period. And then if you jump forward a little bit to the colonial period, 1800 to about 1950, specifically Africa grew at a real per capita income of 0.6% per year, while Europe grew at 1.3% and the US at 1.6% per year. So it's important to remember this because there's already a tie between economies in the majority world, or the formerly colonized regions, as I sometimes call them, and the West, or colonizer countries, if you will. But we spoke about you spoke about, Toby, having flag independence, and that immediate post-independence. And Leah and I have just come out of a really interesting meeting and convening in Ghana, looking at specifically that immediate post-independence period, the days of Nyerere, of Nkrumah, of Sankara. And they really had progressive rollouts of a developmentalist agenda in their developmental tracks. This included land reform, improving workers' wages, investing in public services like healthcare and education in a real tangible way, nationalizing key resources like oil, and there's many cases of this, protecting domestic industries with trade tariffs and subsidies to protect really local industry, and really as well clamping down on capital flight. They were really addressing the causes of underdevelopment and really working on at least trying to, based on our terms. Again, it's not to romanticize that period. There was a lot of things that didn't go right, but there was a lot of things that went right based on our terms. And in this period, remember what I said our per capita growth was. In the 50s to the 70s, our per capita income really grew to 3.2% per year. And so you can see, even in terms of growth, as much as I don't advocate for a centralization of economic growth specifically as a sign for development, even based on that metric, we were growing somewhere. There were substantial reductions in poverty. It began for the very first time to close the income gap between the North and the South. And this was led really by the non-aligned movement founded in the 60s by progressive leaders like Nkrumah from Ghana, Sukarno from Indonesia, Nehru from India, and Nasser from Egypt. I know there's a lot to be said on both good and bad with leaders like Nasser in Egypt and Nkrumah, but there's still so much to learn from. They argued for a fair global economic system with real democracy at the UN and resisted a neocolonialism from both the West, which was pushing a capitalist agenda, and the USSR, which was pushing a communist agenda. What they were pushing for was a third way. Now, even in this last meeting that we had in Ghana, we really had struggles trying to think of the names of women that took part in this immediate post-independence period. And it's very hard to find them. And, you know, it was a period where our women's voices were invisibilized. It is a critique of the period. They're there. It just takes a little bit more digging, but it's up to us really, and the work that Liberation Alliance Africa, NAWI, and many others are doing is to try and uncover these voices and make sure that they're forefront in the story of our history, in the story of our development, even when it comes to economics. But then I don't know if I should stop here or go into, you know, beyond that. We then started descending into this nightmare of structural adjustment programs that came with privatization, cuts to social spending, trade liberalization, cutting tariffs and subsidies, and really also cutting protections on both our labor and environment. And if you look at the graphs, there's a solid growth line on GDP per capita. Again, GDP is not a measure that I encourage people to use, but even based on that, it grew from about, you know, a little over $1,000, $1,200, $1,300 per capita in the 1960s, and it steadily grew to almost 1,500 in the 70s. But as we saw structural adjustment come, it then began to crash down to almost 1,000 back again. So you can see how our economic trajectory, influenced by Western forces, compared to what happens to our economies in our own hands, being shaped by us, what that difference means and what that actually meant for people living on the ground. I mean, there's stories, and I'm going to stop soon, but stories of that my parents tell me of, you know, the streetlights in Nairobi would tell you how fast you needed to be driving for you to hit all the streetlights green. Now that sounds like a story of fiction to me. Or milk being delivered in glass bottles from the cooperative dairy, which was government coordinated at your doorstep, or being able to go to a local health facility and getting properly treated with some level of dignity and availability of drugs and medical personnel. Those stories that our parents tell us almost seems like fiction, but it is also a reminder to say the things that we fight for are not in abstract, are not utopic visions, but Africa has had them, maybe not perfectly, but there's something there in terms of our story by Africa for us, based on our own terms. And I'll stop there because I think I've spoken a lot.
No, you haven't. You've really, you know, expanded. I don't know if anyone is you know, feeling what I'm feeling, because you've really expanded my mind in this conversation. And I was just thinking about also in Nigeria, how my parents would say that, oh, back in the day, we use ₦1 to buy this and buy that, and we will buy chocolates. Oh, they don't do this biscuit as they used to do them anymore, and all of that. And so it's not really fiction. We've had good times, and yeah, we are not crazy if our dreams are as expansive as they need to be, right? And I'm just going to I'm just going to call Leah up to also share her submissions. Really particularly interested in, Krista mentioned the structural adjustment programs, and also just to hear your reflections on some of the factors that you believe have sustained economic injustice in Africa.
Yeah, I think Crystal has addressed structural adjustment ably, and I feel that a lot of people on this call are the children of structural adjustment and feel the impacts of the society where there are basically no jobs, currency has been devalued, you have to pay money to go to a hospital, you have to pay through your nose to be able to access education. Things that there's a reason why when we're thinking about human rights, we're thinking about things like education and housing and health. Like those are things that are supposed to be basic needs. But if we have to pay for them, then it is, as Nawi's public services agenda calls it, they talk about a commodification of dignity. That is where we are right now. But I want to go back to the colonial period, and also Presto did a good job of talking about the slave trade already. I think the impact of that is well documented. I think what we cannot quantify is just that loss of identity. You can quantify the number of labor hours that were given, that coerced labor hours that were never paid for. It is difficult to quantify for the loss of lives in the Middle Passage. It's difficult to quantify the loss of lives on the cotton plantations, in the sugar fields, sugarcane fields, but also just that loss of culture, the sense of what people were. Within the colonial period, so much happened, but I want to focus on two things. One of them, and mostly because my area of work right now is around taxation, so that is thinking about revenue that's a place that I'm more familiar with. So thinking about what colonial economic policy looked like. So Africa's colonization actually happened quite late compared to the rest of the world. Here we're looking at 18th, 19th century. So by the time, and also perhaps I'll focus quite a bit on British Africa, like British colonies. When we think about what they call the metropole, that would be Great Britain and the periphery. That would be where we are located. So people in the metropole were already disenchanted with the idea of colonialism, and also the idea of using their own money to go and fund this adventure of imperialism that some everyday people, so that they were not necessarily benefiting from, because it was mostly the big families, the big old names that were benefiting from, first of all, the slave trade and colonialism, but also some people, I know that Hazel Kirby does a very good job of linking even the benefits for working class Britons and saying, you know, you're not from a big family with a big, you're not from a noble family, but you still benefited from the proceeds of colonialism, because it then came and subsidized industry, as Fatima talked about earlier. And what I'm interested in is the cost of administration within the colonial period. So while the scramble for Africa was happening, in the Britain basically had a strategy of self-sufficiency. So to say that you're going to have colonial officials on the continent and you have to fund yourselves. So I had to figure out where we're going to generate the money from. So that is the direct link to taxation. So you have an economy
I think Leah's network has failed. I was hoping that the gods of internet will favor everyone today. Okay. I think she would be back and she will be able to complete her submission, but maybe we can go to Fatima.
Okay, sure. It's such a shame because like she was really
Yes.
educating us there. Okay, so hopefully she can come back and continue. Okay, so I think I'll pick up actually from where Crystal left off regarding the structural adjustment programs to a certain extent, but just speaking generically about how important it is for us to understand how the colonial patterns and structures of extraction have continued well beyond these declarations of African independence. And I think the systems that have now been created so that we can actually understand how that has worked. I mean, it's not unreasonable to argue, that essentially in order to maintain this illusion of an equal playing field, which is effectively what the global north has tried to suggest since the independence movement, succeeded, and the creation of our independent nation states, there is now this narrative that we are all on an equal playing field, when we know absolutely that we are not, because of those patterns of accumulation and the ascendancy that came about. The WTO is a classic example of that. The World Trade Organization is a membership organization, and you wield more influence based on your market size. So if your market is already enormous as a result of the fact that you have extracted through slavery and colonization from all other countries for the past 400 years. Obviously, now today in the 21st century, you are going to be in a far better position, which means that the idea that free trade agreements are inherently just collaboration and are inherently just a process of supporting one another through free trade and through development, when you have a trade agreement between a global north country and a global south country, is absolute nonsense. But yet we are fed this, and we are told this, and we are asked to believe this because we have a sovereign state. We have our own country, we have our own president, etc. And so therefore we must be on an equal playing field together. And basically, the extraction has gone on to take indirect and very layered and very nuanced forms in the post-independence era, in order to ensure that power imbalance continues. So we've got global northern-owned transnational corporations who are able to leverage power within the global economy to, for example, cheapen prices of resources and labor within the global south, and therefore within Africa, and through commodity chains, as well as ensuring that there will always be low-wage manufacturing labor that primarily benefits consumers and needs in the global north. This has led, we have many feminists who have spoken and written on this. This has led to land grabs, acquisitions, deals, investments, who have also become not only a source of controlling that land and that natural resource extraction. And remember, we mentioned earlier that many African societies, this was land that was not owned necessarily by one dominant, dictating ruler, but actually common land that communities would have access to. And essentially, we also had the creation of cheap labor accumulation as part of that process. So what is being taken is not just our land and not just our resources within this new neo-colonialist framework, but also our labor is being brought in and essentially used and subsumed into, for example, low-paying global value chains. And so we have a loss of own or common land that comes as a result of this kind of consolidation that takes place, and this leads to shortages of water, food, and other forms of natural resources that traditionally you had far easier access to, and your economy was able to also maintain and find ways to make far more sustainable through those indigenous processes, which have now essentially been lost. And the SAPs in the 80s and 90s in many ways has really kind of consolidated that. And as we moved into the 21st century, there are other forms that the SAPs essentially took. Recently, we've been talking about the IMF loans that are being rolled out as structural adjustment, 2.0, but I think we're actually beyond 2.0, because if you look at the beginning of the 21st century, we had the poverty reduction strategy papers, which were effectively just the SAPs being kind of reinvented in a different way, because what they were essentially asking for were the same sorts of conditions for, in this case, and also aid money. And so you have this kind of continuous assault that's coming both from the IFIs like the IMF, but also increasingly from the aid donors, of whom many are previous colonial relationships such as UK aid, etc. And all of that, creates these various pillars which maintains that foundation, and increasingly has created a real amnesia of some of the examples that both Crystal and Leah talked about in terms of what things were actually like in the early independence period, so that we now have a couple of generations that have no memory of that. I was a kid in sort of 1981, 82, 83, and I remember the Naira being pretty much equal to the pound. And I've heard, the stories of the groundnut mountains that we had in northern Nigeria, and of, the corned beef factories that were being built, all of which were being created in order to remove us and take us away from the oil dependency that has now beleaguered our country for all of these decades. And that was essentially curtailed, this kicking away of the ladder that we know has happened, where essentially we have been asked to develop on a completely different trajectory to which European countries and the USA itself developed, which was to heavily subsidize its industries, as well as building many of the social institutions such as those for health, such as those for education, such as those for social welfare, which would ensure that they had a healthy citizenry to engage with the economy in a meaningful way, in a productive way. All of that was essentially prevented. And so we have a case of severe arrested development, and we have lost the historical impetus to understand a lot of that. And there are many reasons for that, which if I was to go into would completely, take over the conversation. So I won't. But I think revisiting and understanding our histories and the way in which our social development trajectories were effectively curtailed in gestation is one of the first things we need to do at the national level and at the continental level if we are to actually get beyond where we are now.
Thank you so much, Fatima. And I do agree with you that the disruption that we need cannot just start at the continental level, peripheral level, that we do need to look at the national level and also maybe trickle it down to the local context also, and even see how, women in local communities are organizing and also, doing economics differently. I know that in my community, there's this thing we call ajo in Yoruba, like women gather, contribute money together and save up. Oh, for the end of the year, my mother does that. And everything you ask her, she's like, oh, I collect my contribution at the end of the year. So anything you want must wait till the end of the year, right? And these are ways that, they just manage their economic, they manage their money and finance and all of that. And I'm also reflecting on, about women's riot, which was initiated because of, tax injustice in Nigeria during the colonial era. So we do need to, look back and reflect on the work that has been done. Leah, you dropped off, and as much as we prayed for the internet to favor everyone, unfortunately, your prayers were not answered to the fullest, but I'm glad that you are back. You were lecturing us, on tax administration during the colonial era. I wanted to know if you wanted to finish that submission.
I think that was going to be long-winded. So let me just start by sharing these examples, and then I'll make my point. So I wanted to share a statistic from Nyasaland, what was then called Nyasaland, which is, I think people in this, some of them might be too young and they'll be asking, what is Nyasaland? That's present-day Malawi. So to pay the tax, to pay the salary, the monthly salary of one colonial administration official, and let me check to see who this official was. This is not the governor or somebody like that. This is to pay the salary of one senior clerk. So imagine a senior clerk within the colonial administration. They needed to tax 1,600. I don't know, what's someone from Nyasaland called? Anyway, in the report, they say natives, but people that lived in Nyasaland, the natives, 1,600 of them needed to pay tax in order to meet the salary of one colonial administrator. Yeah, a clerk, not the governor, not, I don't know what other. So, and then another statistic that I want to share is that when you look at the budgetary allocations within Kenya, and this was a time when the colonial administration was in charge, I think between 1901 and 1910. If you look at the budget priorities, you have about 25% of those resources going to colonial administrators' salaries. You have another 25% going to the police, and then only 4% going to social services, 4%. The larger point that I'm making is to ask young people, as happens now in classrooms, what are the benefits of colonialism, is to insult them and to be violent. Because the colonial administration was set up to be extractive and for the benefit of empire. Any economic investments that were done on this continent were only for the purposes of being carted away. There is a reason why right now, one of the problems that we face, and something that we talked about at length in the meeting that I was with with Crystal, is that dependence on primary commodities. the colonial administration was never interested in diversifying the economy for the benefit of the natives. They were interested in one thing only. So if I'm interested in cotton, cotton it is you will grow. If I am interested in cocoa, cocoa it is you will grow. And it is not to, and it wasn't that then factories were built here and jobs were created and an infrastructure was left behind at the end of the colonial period. It was all those things for export to be then brought back as imports for people to buy. So you can see a clear system of unequal exchange. And those were the same systems that were inherited at independence. So in the immediate post-independence period, the task that the leaders had was to undo that infrastructure of extraction, which was so difficult because those are some of the things that we're dealing with now. Not just undoing that infrastructure, but now finding the financing for them to put into, for them to realize this vision of not just a politically autonomous Africa, but also an economically autonomous Africa. One of the things that we learned from the Ghanaian experience is that Nkrumah had all these dreams. He had massive dreams about industrialization. Let us set up a dam. We need to generate electricity and build factories because industrialization is intrinsic to that process of development. But where are you going to get money to build a dam? And his hopes were hinged on cocoa. But then remember, the prices of cocoa are not being determined by you. They're global prices. So when cocoa crashed, it means that you don't have any resources. So he was forced to go back to the same people that he was criticizing and to ask for money. And so then our colonial reconquest basically started by us not being economically autonomous. And that is what then created room for people to come and say the independence project has failed. Africans cannot govern themselves, and created room for the IMF and the World Bank to then come and make prescriptions about what we had to do, which then led up to structural adjustment. But then what now you have additionally is the neoliberal turn. So add and star, and then you have the crisis that exists now. So basically just what I wanted to highlight was just that system of extraction that was inherited and has not been completely undone. And perhaps in thinking about a more liberatory future, those are some of the things that we need to focus on.
Thank you so much, Leah, and really thank you to every one of our speakers and even everyone listening and just participating in the chat during this conversation. You can put down your questions if you have any in the chat, and I'll read them aloud. We have just about 2 more questions before we bring the conversation to a close. So if you have any more questions that you'd like to ask the speakers, please do that, and you can also share your thoughts via Twitter and tag us. Before I ask my last question, I think one of the questions I would like to ask again, since we are really talking about exploitation and extraction, I've been thinking about the role of women, African women, and how Krista mentioned earlier that it's really difficult to document or to even read about historically women's participation in all of these economic activities, right? And I just wanted to hear your thoughts around what you think about social reproduction at the intersection of kinship and exploitation of African women. And what does that mean in the context of economic justice? So when we look back and we see what women were doing then and what women are doing now, and how even in the past, you know, we've read, for example, the Aba Women's Riots, their role in, you know, pushing back against economic or tax injustice in Nigeria. And I'm sure there are other stories that, you know, we can link to women disrupting policies that, you know, that are exploitative and all of that. So to hear more about that based on your knowledge and experience on social reproduction at the intersection of kinship and exploitation of African women. Now, I don't know, Fatima, I always start Leah, Krista, then now Fatima.
Okay, great. Thank you. I just wanted to just say one thing on the back of the points around economic autonomy and the importance of economic autonomy. But to actually say that before we get to economic autonomy, I think one of the things that we have completely lacked, and ultimately it is not our fault, it's actually as a result of the systems that have been put in place, is political solidarity. Because economic autonomy immediately post-independence was almost always going to be impossible, simply because all of those institutions had been created by the colonial powers, and also these countries that were effectively created. I mean, Africa as a continent has more straight lines on it than anywhere else on the map, right? And so you see how flawed actually the idea of many of our nation states is for that reason. So to ask for economic autonomy when we're still even trying to work that out as a country, as individual countries, is really, really tough. What we lack is political solidarity more than anything on the continent. So many of, when the commodity crisis hit, which is what led to many of our countries feeling forced to take on the IMF's recommendations with their loans, the one thing that we lacked there was that political solidarity across the continent. Now, the independence movements had attempted various forms of political solidarity in the run-up to independence and even afterwards, and there was difficulty reaching consensus for a variety of different reasons. And over the last 60 years, we have found that more fractured. Makandaweri and Saludo, two of our greatest economists, have pointed out that our relationships as individual countries with external partners are always far more important than our existing relationships with each other. And this is one of the reasons why they're so deeply fragmented. And I think the question of political solidarity is one that we just never discuss enough as a continent, and how we take positions. What do I mean by that? How we take positions collectively against things that we know are inherently unfair. If you see one country is being subjected to one IMF deal that is absolutely horrendous and is going to continue to extract, leave them open to economic volatility, vulnerability, etc., what are the positions that other African countries are going to take collectively? Because ultimately, as a continent, we are treated together. Even though we have these independent relationships, we are put in the same box for the most part, apart from when they try to separate us continuously from North Africa, and the creation of the MENA region, some would argue, as a term, is something was done deliberately in order to ensure that sub-Saharan Africa was constantly separate. And so we had a constant bifurcation within the continent as a result of that, and we continue to suffer for that. But I'll stop there and I'll speak to the question that you actually asked, which I think is really, really important. And and I think what we need to do first of all is understand the way in which the SAPs actually impacted women effectively. And we've got more than enough information on this. And so we know that there was this perpetual need for finance, which meant that our external relationships were always going to be stronger with those ex-colonial powers. But what we find essentially is that the hollowing out of the state, women were always on the front line of. So as public sector jobs were lost, many women had, jobs within that space, because as we know, the public sector across the world is one of the greatest employers of women. They now found themselves essentially moving back into the informal space. And now we talk about Africa as a continent of essentially women's informality. And we also know that, hospitals crumbled, schools crumbled, welfare support packages were cut. All of these have far greater impact on women than they do men in any country in the world. And what this did was it transferred all of the costs of those services onto the household through user fees for public goods and services. But then what it meant was we also had to go back to our existing kinship and familial relationships in order to pick up the slack for a lot of things that our post-independent countries had started putting into place. So, here we're talking about the welfare support packages that would have eventually, had they been allowed, arguably to develop, allowed women to access childcare, elderly care, and a whole variety of other essential services, which today are just not in existence. And that social reproduction and the way in which social reproduction was essentially pushed back as an onus onto the familial and the community structure, and the way in which women continue to absorb that as a result of gendered roles, etc., has been one of the most strategic things that has resulted as the neoliberal project rolled itself out, because we know that neoliberal capitalism, in order to succeed, is actually dependent on this unwaged work in order for itself to succeed. It's essentially free labor. So it's another continuation of the way in which capitalism has never, it seems, been able to survive without some kind of free labor. Slavery in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, and actually women's labor has been critical to the capitalist project in various ways, because the enormous amount of social reproduction that is needed in order for the capitalist economy to be productive is essentially just written off by women's bodies, by women's emotional, capacity to continue to be elastic in their ability to produce that labor. Because, when it comes to care is something that only stops when a woman breaks. That's the reality of it. It is fully elastic. It will not stop until a woman breaks, because attached to that care are often familial caring bonds. You're caring for your child, you're caring for your mother, you're caring for your sick sister. So there is no money that is kind of, attached to that will stop you, that will stop you from just delivering that production. And capitalism absolutely needs that in order to succeed, and for the accumulation of wealth to continue to move into a smaller number of hands. And there are many ways in which this can be addressed, and perhaps we will have time, I don't know, to discuss that, but I'll let Priscilla and Leah now have their say on it.
Thank you so much, Fatima. I'm just going to jump in real quick to Krista.
I'd actually like to pass on to Leah, because I know she has to go, and she has such an interesting body of work around labor in Uganda. So I'll come back after her, just in case she has to leave.
Yeah,
yes, thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. Yes, I think I want to start off by just clarifying what social reproduction is. For me, in the simplest terms, it is life-giving work that is done daily and intergenerationally. It's just work that is done to sustain life. The majority of this work is done by women, although not exclusively. So this can involve things like cooking, ironing, planting, like having a little garden or having a big garden, caring for the elderly, caring for children, giving birth. All of that is social reproductive work. And maybe to understand where the point of the exploitation comes in. So Maria Mies does, I think, such a great analysis to talk about, to show the evolution of the cleavage between what is considered productive work and therefore valuable, and social reproductive work, which is now undervalued and is unpaid, as Fatima was talking about. And if we think about, I'm not going to go into the history, but I think that if we look at the colonial encounter, we also need to look at the evolution in labor relations on the continent. So remember how I talked about the colonial administration being extractive, and some of that extraction came from having to pay tax to finance the colonial experiment. And in order to pay that tax, it meant that you needed to produce labor, rather produce surplus, and not just produce surplus, but also sell it so that then you have money, because the colonial administration was not taking tax payment in maize or cocoa or something like that. They needed whatever monetary representation existed at the time. That is how the taxes were being collected. So one of two things happened. Yes, for a time, people were actually able to sustain that just by farming and then selling off their produce. But then that was not enough labor for the colonial experiment as well. And they needed to introduce policies that dispossess people of their land so that they could be pushed into wage labor. The process of conscription into wage labor was a very gendered one, with men preferred to work in the productive sector and the big agricultural projects in the mines, and women were then forced into the realm of the domestic. But this did not happen by accident. This was a Victorian culture that was basically mapped onto the African context, because what you had after the Industrial Revolution is, you know, the emergence of a moneyed class. And so the idea, even at the time when actually women had to work in factories in Great Britain, that then wealthy people or wealthy women could then become just housewives, which then became a desirable identity, because then it communicated your middle class status, and housewives did not necessarily have to work. And then you're imposing this on a culture that does not understand that. What do you mean? And that is why you have the Aba Women's War, because women were part of the public life. And it is important to stress that while patriarchy existed in the African context, there is no denying that. The kind of patriarchy that came with the colonial encounter further changed the way relations were in the African context. So now there was a hard line that was created between the private and the public, and the private was constructed as a domain of women, and work that was done within that sphere was then considered non-work, such that even when that work later on became remunerated, it was still very much devalued. But now what we have, because you've then connected that question to kinship, if we think about it in a more contemporary context, so those of us that grew up on the continent know that if a woman has a child, has a baby, it has never been an experience that is born alone. It is a community project. And it's usually your next of kin who come to help you. Those were usually women who would come and show you how to wash the baby, feed the baby, like just make sure that you're bringing a healthy human. But you see, the thing is, because we now have to go and work, because now wage labor is how we are making, it means that I'm not able to then go and look after my sister or my cousin in the way that I would have been able to in the past, because I'll get penalized for missing work. So we can also see that those relationships of kinship that existed, where we kind of did social reproductive work as a community, no longer exists. Now the work of social reproduction has been recast to be an individual endeavor. And the state has also said, no, this is work that women have to do. So Nancy Fraser talks about capitalism requiring social reproductive work, social reproductive labor, because without women ironing shirts, cooking, all these men would not be able to participate in wage labor. But it treats social reproductive labor as if it were free and infinite. Women do not get tired. Like it's a constant thing that you can constantly mine from without relief. And so that is where it has become exploitative. But beyond that, it has created this identity that it is work that is supposed to be performed solely by women, which is not true. And that is what has brings about the links between basically gender oppression and capitalist accumulation. Maybe to close, I can just illustrate with, maybe I shouldn't talk about this. I'll talk about this another time, because it's such a broad, it is such a broad topic. I think let me leave it at this point. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Leah. And I know you have to leave, but I wanted to hear from everyone. So before you leave, I'm going to catch you on that, about what your wildest economic justice dreams are. I know at LAA, what we do is that we dream, and I know that you all are dreamers in your own way. You've been able to create new realities by forming theories and also interrogating the existing structures within the economic justice space. So I would really like to hear your thoughts around when you sleep or when you think about economic justice. What do you think about?
For me, my wildest dream is to be able to work because I love the work, but not to work because I need to pay my rent or that I might die. I don't want, so capitalism has like a carrot and stick method that he uses. It's like, if you do not work, we'll get the stick out. And that is like, there's a constant threat of hunger. There's a constant threat of, if I do not work, if I don't have health insurance, then I will not be able to treat myself, to treat my family. So then our lives, our dreams, everything that we wish for ourselves rotates around the work that we do, to the end that it becomes our very identity. So to work is to live, and I do not want that. I want to be independent from my work. I want to be able to work to produce what I need, because I think we ultimately have to work, but I don't want work to become my life. And so for me, this is a dream that I have for myself, that I have for my family, but I also hope that this is where we are all headed, so that then our reality is not that of work without relief.
Truly, truly, and amen to that. Honestly, because I do not want to work because I have rent to pay, or I have to buy food or anything like that. But I would really like everyone to also put in the chat what's their wildest economic justice dream. You know, there was a time, I think it was 2 years ago, I was selected for AFMA, that's the African Feminist Macroeconomics Academy. And that was my first time of meeting Crystal. And she mentioned something around, so we were discussing around thinking about public service and just dreaming. And she just mentioned the statement of saying, how can we dream of something that we've never really experienced? Like, why are we talking about, access to public health, or we've never really experienced public health in our own generation? And it just struck me that I've never really experienced public health or good public transportation, good public system, like nothing like that in my generation. All I hear is what my parents have told me about how, Nigeria was really good at their time and all of that. But it will really be interesting if we dream about new realities and not just, what we've been told, what is possible for us. So it's important that we do that. So I want you to put it in the chat, what your wildest dreams are. And I'll go to Crystal now. If Crystal still wants to share a submission on the last question around social reproduction, or we can just move to the last question. The last question is around your wildest dream on economic justice, and really just to tell us, we know the work that you're doing, the work that Fatima is doing, the work that Leah is doing, and there are so many other economic justice activists, crusaders, and scholars out there in Africa and in diaspora, working to, push the needle into the right direction. And just to hear your thoughts on, some of your takes on how we can organize to disrupt macroeconomics policies and usurp neoliberalism. These are the things that you're already doing, but just to hear, because I know that we have diverse groups of audience in the room, and then you will tell us your wildest economic justice dreams, and then we'll go to Fatima.
Yeah, so I don't even know where to start. Also, on the last question, I think Fatima and Leah put it like, yeah, I don't need to, what they said.
Retweets.
And just, yes, what they said. But also, I think it's important to remember that even as we are going through such a tumultuous time, it feels like the structural adjustment programs, again, on Red Bull, I always say this, there are pockets of resistance. There's the women in Senegal resisting on agricultural commodification of seeds, having their seed banks. The seed banks also here in Kenya, where it's illegal to trade and share seeds, which seems so ridiculous to me. But there's signs of that, of solidarity economics. It's the groups that you spoke about, Toby. It's the Chama that my mom is part of that makes sure, she's able to access affordable credit just from her own group as and when she needs it. There's people pushing back on land reform and land tenure for women. So there's so much work that's there. And I think sometimes, at least I'm a victim of this. It's so overwhelming, the problem. We seem to sometimes forget that there are glimmers of hope and resistance. I don't like to use the term resilience because that sort of celebrates a hardship by us that we shouldn't really have to be celebrating. But what do we do from here? And I think it's important to remember that we resist in collective, and we must resist in collective. Nanjala Nyabola speaks about working to build a solidarity that crosses time and space, one that is not about making everyone the same, but about allowing for the specific and the general, finding that which is human on the other end and protecting it. And so we resist by redefining, by reclaiming, by reshaping our narratives based on our own experiences, our own histories, our nuances, and our collective destiny, a collective destiny that really encompasses both people and planet. And it's really important to remember, not just for us, but for this planet, which kind of feels like, I think I was speaking to Fatima a few months ago, it feels like the planet's kicking us out, right? And like with all this climate change, it'll regenerate and it'll be okay, maybe even better without us, extracting and degrading and all the terrible things that we do. So I think at the heart of it is this collective thinking, but also our feminist praxis will center on the ability to reclaim and recreate a future. And this relies really heavily, and we've spoken about this, our ability to dream. To really, I speak about this a lot, so apologies for repeating myself for those who've heard me, to unshackle ourselves from our current reality and really be audacious enough to dream of new models, new systems, new way of governance, new way of organizing, like, you guys are doing at LAA. This will also mean letting go of hierarchies of epistemology and decolonizing what knowledge we have, whose work is important because it's presented in a certain way. And that means they get seats at tables of power and decision. Resistance to me also means refocusing the struggle as well. And again, I lean to Lina Some, who's at the University of Makerere, and she says, we cannot keep fighting simply in order to survive. Our struggles are meaningless and certainly not revolutionary if they don't also offer a serious possibility to thrive as human beings. And this is really what Leah was speaking about, not being tied to work to be able to live in dignity. And so linked to that is my dream, and I have many. Toby, when you spoke about, that AFMA a long while ago, we did a piece called In a Time Not So Far Away, and I'll put it in the link, where we were reimagining. And it was so hard to imagine what it would be like to go down the street if I'm not feeling well to a public service hospital and get the medication I need if I do. Or I don't know, maybe get a different healing practice. I don't know, maybe my practitioner would tell me to burn some sage instead of giving me an antibiotic. Who knows? But really imagining this was really hard for us. But it's important and it's political to use imagination, because unless we define what we're working towards, we don't know what we need to change. It's touted off as frivolous, as, very literary things that feminists do, but that is the political underpinning of the work and things that we're pushing for. So one, it's important to do that. I would like to buy batik from Nigeria and have a way to get it in my home. I'd like for my Ghanaian friends to be able to buy purple tea from Kenya. I would like to get music records from South Africa. I would like to be able to cross by road from Nairobi to Gabon. I would like to go to a hospital that actually works and not have to think of a job that allows me private health insurance to access decent healthcare. I would like so many things. I don't want my work to define me. I would like to grow flowers and arrange flowers, and that be work. I would like to have communes of feminists and women where we laugh under trees and have eating mangoes and mango juice dripping down our hands. That's in a way that we all feel safe, cared for, and deserving of being here. That's my dream.
Krista, I'm already in your dreams, because this is the dream that we want, and I don't know if anyone else is affirming that with me, because yes, this is it. I want to be able to buy kitenge in Uganda and have it delivered at my doorstep without having to ask, hey, please, who is coming to Nigeria? Or is, all of those trade barriers. And yes to all that dreams. And I hope truly that we are working towards liberation, and we're working towards making those dreams become reality. Fatima, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, all of that to be honest with you.
Yeah.
And I want to shout out to Ophelia in the chat, who pretty much kind of wrote my dream in many ways in one very simple comment. So I hope it's okay if I just read it out, because I think it speaks so strongly kind of what I'm about to say. My wildest economic dream is to live in a commune where all domestic labor is socialized, especially food, healthcare, childcare, and laundry, and I can participate in labor for others without having to work 9 to 5. I would challenge anyone to find anyone on the planet who is not an extremely privileged elite, billionaire or even millionaire, who would not dream of that, to be honest with you, or something similar. But what's interesting is when we are asked this question, you know, sometimes there is a fear that if you come out with something that sounds really radical, you will be consigned to the bin of, you know, such an extremism. The idea actually that you want everybody to be happy and share equally is seen as this kind of extremism, right? And it's seen almost as an alternate extremism to the right wing, and seen almost as being as equally extreme for some reason that I always struggle with. But ultimately, this is about a future or a dream of well-being and flourishing. So I think Crystal, you know, sort of really unpacked for us in terms of what it could look like in its individual experience. But we have to also ask ourselves, what would it take to get there? And if we are completely honest, one of the first things that needs to happen is we have to have a commitment to redistribution of wealth, right? And that is going to be one of the biggest battles, a redistribution and a movement away from the desire to privately accumulate. And this is something that all of us do. So it's almost, I have to work on myself even as an individual, you know, to be committed to the idea of undoing the need for private accumulation that has effectively, we've all been raised with. As was said earlier, you know, we are all children of the structural adjustment programs. We're all children of essentially this idea that capitalist and neoliberal capitalism in particular is the only way to be, and a part of that is to be deeply individual and to strive for this wealth. So that redistribution is critical. A move towards common ownership is one of my greatest dreams, you know. And this idea of kind of sharing labor is something that so many people will struggle with, especially those who have the ability now to outsource their labor to others, you know, their domestic labor to others, but also those of us, for example, who do not have to, you know, who do not take jobs as janitors, as street cleaners, you know, as dustbin, refuse persons, all of those roles. I actually have a dream that we live in a society where everybody works and contributes to that. You know, the most radical kind of dreamers have sort of envisaged that as we'll create robots to do it all. Okay, but before that, before that, and before the robots take over the world on the back of it, this idea that we all actually pitch in to do this hard, basic, boring labor, which will then free the society, actually free the society where people can now pursue these things, where you do grow flowers and where leisure is no longer dominated by 9 to 5 work. There has to be a willingness to commit to that. And that means giving up privilege. So my wildest dream is actually that we are all able to find within ourselves a desire to give up privilege and to return in many ways to the kind of collective engagement that I think many of our earlier societies, and I'm not saying that every pre-colonial African society was like this, because absolutely it was not, but that many of our earlier societies were just, this was just the way in which human societies organize themselves. And I think we can draw a lot from that remembering and that learning, and then reimagining it and imagining even more wildly for our modern age and where we could go for that. So I think everything that has been said, but then also a dream of really being fearless enough to radically demand what needs to happen in order for us to get to that dream. Because unless we do that, it won't.
Thank you so much, Fatima. And I can see Crystal with the tabs. And the chat is also buzzing with so many dreams, so many dreams. Faith Oluokun said, I would like to get an education in a discipline I like, not because it has better career and economic prospects. And yes, to that, because this is like one of the common issues that we face as young people. Oh, this is the most prospective career opportunity, and I think you should go to school for that. And people are just stuck in, you know, careers that they didn't even like in the first place. I'm seeing another dream. Nana says, I want to travel the earth without my passport restricting me. That green card, Nigerian passport. I know, me too. Maureen said, I dream of an Africa without uncompromised, selfish leaders that continuously derail our economic independence, freedom, and justice. Yes to that. And thank you, Krista, for the champagne or water. Thank you so much, everyone, for contributing to this conversation. This has been really interesting, engaging, and informative. I would really want to thank Fatima, Krista, and Leah in absentia for taking out time to really engage with us, interrogate all of these issues with us, and really, expand our minds on these concepts and frameworks. Thank you all for joining, and for those that have stayed till the end, thank you so much. This is a recorded conversation, and we'll be uploading on our YouTube, and we would also be sharing bits of this conversation from Nana has drawn up a post conversation strategy. So look out on our social media for all of our creative ideas of disbursing this webinar. We are deeply appreciative of everyone's time, commitment, and especially our speakers. As I've said earlier, this is the third installation of the 5-part series. So we'll be having 2 more webinars under this series. You can follow us on our social media to get updates on when we'll be having those conversations. And you can also sign up for our newsletter. Crystal has been so kind to share some resources in the chat. We'll compile all of them and share with everyone after the conversation alongside the recorded version of this conversation. Thank you, everyone, again, and I wish you all the best wherever you are in the world, and keep disrupting spaces, keep smashing the patriarchy, and keep resisting in collective. Have a good day, everyone. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, people.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.